I'd just like to make two comments based upon the two parts of your paper. The first one is about the educational exclusion. And I'd just like to give you some data from one of my countries, which happens to be Britain, which is puzzling to explain. And it'd be nice if you had an explanation for it. So if we take Great Britain while it lasts as a whole, the following are true statistically. Who does best in the British educational system up to the end of school leaving? Answer, Asian girls. Secondly, who does worst in British education over the same time range? Answer, working class white boys. Statistic 3, who is disproportionately represented in so-called special education, which is actually custodial, it's not special in any other educational sense? Answer, tall, black Caribbean boys. Boys from the Caribbean. So, you know, we have three very different migrant groups here, which cannot be covered by this general bromide statement that, you know, more education will solve the whole problem. It won't. It has to be more differentiated and, as you said, more experiential. So that's just a question mark over that. I don't have an answer to it. And the second one is about part 2 of your paper, when you looked at culture as non-homogeneous, differentiated, what can we do about it? And I think the generic answer you gave is the same one I would give. It's for civil society to encourage syncretism in practice. And I'll just give you two examples of this to show that this is realistic rather than just one of these things that writers of reports say. Last week, one of our Nigerian trafficked women gave birth to a little girl. There is a father. The father wishes to marry, wishes to found a family, but neither of them have the legal right to remain. Now, what they attached significance to, that people would very readily put cultural in front of it, was something which is non-religious, but is important in their Yoruba tradition, called the naming ceremony, which occurs on the 8th day. It's the octave of the child's life. And it was brilliant to see how syncretism worked. In this case, with our Holy Mother, the Church, whose parish priest was initially rather resistant, or at least feared, of this naming day ceremony. You know, isn't this voodoo? Isn't this? No, it's not. It's a naming day ceremony. That took about 2 evenings to convey, at the end of which he said, well, that's fine. There's no problem, is there? No, none at all. So we had a very happy naming day ceremony. The second example is a completely secular one from University of Warwick, which has something called unitemps, temporary volunteers who pick their own good cause and volunteer to devote however many hours a week to it. And it concerned those Muslim women who may or may not have been wearing the veil, may have been wearing the veil combined with blue jeans and Doc Martens boots, to summon the full burqa. What did they have in common as a cultural demand? We wish to learn to ride a bike. Because bikes are cheap, they give you mobility, and there is actually no cultural barrier against a Muslim woman riding a bike. Maybe about her driving in certain Muslim countries, but not biking. So the temporary volunteers found a tennis court disused among some trees, so there couldn't be observers, or not readily. And this was exceedingly popular. And now we have the sight coming into the university of Muslim women wearing whatever of their own on bikes. So it can be done in practice. But as you rightly said, so long as the desire for that practice comes from them, rather than being imposed upon them as some standardized curriculum. So that's just for you to comment upon.
Yeah, thank you. I think that this case you have mentioned with the bikes is an example of imagination and practical reason. And I think that most conflicts must be solved at that level. So that's the reason why the conflicts we often theorize about in the media, or in very abstract terms, can be solved as long as they are considered in practice, in practical terms, and they are involved in they participate in the elaboration of a response, a solution. No? It's not imposed, but it's the result of a deliberation, a mutual deliberation. So I think that's the road to solve many practical conflicts. Perhaps not all of them, because sometimes you will find real problems, no? Polygamy, for instance, you have a problem here, no? But, daily activities are not all the time around those kind of principles, but about many small issues that can be solved at the practical level. So I basically agree with that. And then I don't have any explanation for the statistics you mentioned, but it's interesting to analyze why Asian girls do better than working class boys, and why, but I don't have any, I could invent an explanation, but it's better that I don't do that. Okay.
Thank you. Parta, did you ask for?
Thank you very much. That's a great paper. Thank you very much. I wanted to raise something related to Margaret's first point, because you haven't touched on it, but I just wanted to curious as to how your thoughts go. So when one thinks of minorities who have been genuinely excluded from the education sector, so to speak, unlike the British case, the girls aren't excluded, nor are the boys. I'm thinking of Copts in Middle East. I'm thinking of Parsis in India. Not now, maybe, but, and of course, I'm thinking of Jews in Europe, right through. You take it, and yet their performance, there must have some internal energy within their communities which enable them to flourish in the most magnificent way. And have you any thoughts about that?
I don't know about Copts in Egypt, but I do have an hypothesis about Jews, which they have been trained in reading the Bible. They have a tradition of dealing with the text and commenting on the text, and I think one of the reasons why they are so extraordinary in cultural issues is because they are supported by this long tradition, internal tradition. So I always admire Jews because of that, because the way they...
So do I, yeah.
Yes. But this is my,
Can I just follow up? The reason I raised it, in your case, is that we are tempted to, because we are reasonable people, I like to think we are reasonable people, from the examples that you've given, that in some sense it's external world which prevents, and there's nothing that they can do. We're always looking at these terrible cases. And these exceptional cases that we are important because it suggests that even despite the adversity that, say, the Jews have suffered all through centuries.
Okay, thank you. Professor Yac.
Thank you. Many thanks for your paper. Very interesting and relevant. I wonder if you can elaborate on two additional dimensions that I find in educational exclusion, at least partial exclusion. In many countries, I even would say in most of the countries, in different parts of the world, the public education, the state-delivered education is in crisis because either a problem of quality or problems of values. In the case of quality problems, it's very clear that even state-run schools attended by the richer people are better, are richer, have more resources than state-owned schools attended by the poor. So we have a very subtle process of educational exclusion. And the other one is because of values. The counterexample would be the homeschooling in the United States. Around 3 million people attend, or not attend, have homeschooling in the United States, and one of the main drivers of this process, apparently, it is disagreement of the parents with the values lived factually, sometimes even doctrinally, but factually in a state-owned school. Do you have some thoughts on this process of economic exclusions? And one of the consequences, for instance, is that in very poor countries, in Africa, for instance, they are appearing private companies that supply education at very low cost, very, very low cost, like $10 per month or something like that. And they are increasing the enrollment very quickly. So, but this is a complete new world in which process perhaps the poorest would not benefit because the ones that tend to abandon the public systems and to go to attend private schools are the ones whose parents are have more initiative or more resources or more links with social links, etc. No?
Well, I don't have any opinion about this problem because I haven't thought about that. So I could invent something else, but it's not my role. I do have an opinion about the homeschooling. I don't like that very much because I think that the school provides a social setting which is necessary for the kids to grow in a normal way, you know. But I'm not an expert in education, so I don't want to elaborate more than that. But my first take is that, you know, that doesn't work because education has a public social dimension which cannot be bypassed without damage for the kid. So anyway, I would leave the problem here because, yeah.
Mr. Mguni, if I read well, Mr. Mguni is a student of Professor Zulu.
Thank you, Chair. Very interesting paper. The question that it came to my mind, and I think also triggered by a comment by the Chancellor earlier, of a need not just only to give knowledge, but also to teach ethical values and all these other things. What is the role of education in promoting active citizenry? And I'll juxtapose that with an earlier comment that you made about universalistic approaches. How far should we localize the development of the textbook in a world where international rankings are becoming so important, and sort of trying to create a homogeneous global education system that sort of delivers similar ideas to society? So really, and also you spoke about educational exclusion, but there's another exclusion that happens even to people that have access to the educational resources, where you find that people feel in the curriculum they do not reflect themselves. In South Africa, recently there's been a big movement for decolonization of the curriculum itself and attempts towards an inclusive education curriculum that reflects on things such as sexuality in the classroom to conscientize the students and future citizens of the country. So really, given those dynamics, the exclusion that happens also when you have accessed the educational resource itself, how do we mediate that, and do students really have a say in what they should or they think they ought to be learning?
Well, I have an anecdote. It happened, I commented it to Margaret this morning. On Monday, I interviewed a candidate for our master program. He's from Mexico, and he's a philosopher, but he has done some social work in an indigenous community in Mexico, in Chiapas. And when I asked him about the reasons for doing a program in social sciences, and so, he told me that he was struck by the fact that the indigenous population didn't want to participate in anything because after going through the educational process, they felt humiliated, or they felt they didn't have anything to offer. They didn't, they felt alienated from their own traditions, their own culture. So I think that's a deep problem. If the effects of our educational system is to alienate people from their own traditions and culture, then there is a problem there. And this is what I mean when I speak about combining a global approach that they need in order to be prepared for entering the global circuits if they want, but at the same time preserving a pride, their pride, the pride of being part of that community, which after all is where they were born, and you know what I mean? So this is of course a difficult problem, and to find a proper balance, probably you need to work in the field. There is no universal educational policy that can solve that problem if you don't have the people somehow involved in the process of designing the curricula, and even if that seems unrealistic, well, it's something that we can try, because what is proven is that the other system doesn't work, because they don't want to participate, they don't feel they have the ability to do that. So it's a difficult balance, but again, I think that the way to approach it is by focusing on practice and to involve people in practice. No? Yeah.
Professor Gregory Reichenberg is a friend of all time, and I welcome his new membership in our academy.
Thanks very much, Victorio. I think we've known each other for 40 years or so, so that's great. I've revealed my age, maybe, but not yours. Okay. Anyway, I just wanted to say how much I appreciated the paper, and I especially like the sections where you talk about that cultures aren't fixed. There's this myth of the homogeneous social identity. Denmark was a good example, and how all that is just so easily deconstructed. And the point you made about some identities often emerge out of conflict, which is a real problem. You know, I've been working on Iraq. I'll talk about that a little bit tomorrow, but in my paper. But it said that before 2003, there was a Shia identity but no Sunni identity. Now, there was a Shia identity because the Shias were persecuted. And so, you know, they really started to think of themselves as a distinct kind of ethnicity, if you will. Whereas the Sunnis just viewed themselves as the norm, so they didn't have to have an identity. But it's only after they felt that they were persecuted that they became an identity. So, and then you get into really complicated situations where, an identity is formed in opposition to, but then you're living together. And then the question is how to move beyond that. So, and then I like the point you made that from a practical perspective, however, the important thing is that ideas about who we are can be revised in the light of who we want to be when confronted with a new social reality. So now I've seen Iraqis try to sort this out and trying to grope for a way to, do you have any sense of, practically speaking, how who we are can be revised in the light of who we want to be? I mean, is it like a new myth has to emerge? What happens there? Do you have any sense of concretely how you become who you want to be as a group?
Well, I wish I had a solution for all the problems in the world, but I think that there is a point here in recreating the social fabric, and that can be done only, from a bottom-up perspective. Well, I don't know. Okay. From a bottom-up perspective, how do you recreate the social fabric? With micro, at the small interaction level, day-to-day basis, but also probably from an institutional level, making it possible for different people to interact. I am struck by the fact that very often we don't know the people living in our own neighborhood, which is a very small thing. And some of them may be really marginal people. So something is wrong when we don't interact with these people, no? Or when we don't even see them. So this is why I think that also the urban planning, how cities are organized, has such an importance. It's so important. So, how cities are organized, how if we do have opportunities to meet and to talk and to communicate in different contexts, that's the way you create a social fabric. And unfortunately, we are lacking those spaces of mutual interaction in the ways cities are. Okay, that's it. Yeah.
We have four and a request of asking for intervention. I think that the time is expiring, so I suggested to propose the question, to ask the question, and to have only one final answer. And now is Professor Sabourin.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like first to congratulate you on your appointment, wish you luck. I'm sure that in 9 years you may not read as fast as you did. I'm sure you'll have a slower rhythm at that point. Your paper is fascinating in many ways. First of all, because I believe it's a good equilibrium between conceptual analysis and empirical facts. And these facts are worldwide. I want to congratulate you on this. Sometimes, you know, we look so much at some trees or one tree that we forget what the forest is all about. And this is an important fact when we look especially at minorities, exclusions. We would just have to look at the UNESCO last encyclopedia, but very few people do. But you would find that there are 6,000 linguistic and ethnic groups in this dictionary. Unfortunately, maybe half of them are on the way out. But it leaves 3,000 for the future. So it means that we have a lot of work on our hands, and that my friend Donati has a great deal of work to do with multiculturalism. We talk about my own country. I don't want to speak too much about that. But very few people, when they look at Canada, they always think everything is fine and things are moving in the right direction, especially when you know what's happening in North America now. But we have 1 million indigenous people who form what they call now more than 55 nations. And we have had, over the last decades, commissions and commissions to find ways and means on how to cope with this group of people. They compose almost half of Saskatchewan. So we have a great deal of work on our hands, especially that all these minorities, almost everywhere, they are facing terrible problems in health and education, justice and drugs, and I could go on, you know. But there are areas in the world, not only in some countries, but where a lot of extremely good experiences have been going on over the years. But I must say that as I had a chance to spend most of my life abroad in almost every continent, my feeling is that we have a lot of work to do. You give me 1 minute. Think about the Tibetans. Think about the Palestinians. Think about the Kashmiri. Think about the Kurds. And I've been thinking about them since I finished my studies. And I've added, the first time I went to Haiti, Haitians. So every year we think about what has happened in terms of progress or in terms of defeats or conflicts. But every year over the last decade, I've been thinking about these 5 countries. And the problems are very great. And I think that we must realize that we have fantastic problems on our hands.
Monsignor Minera, please, for remaining.
Very shortly, in the light of what
short.
Professor Sabourin said, I think there is one issue we very rarely address. It is precisely the fact that in our countries, namely in Europe, we have regional cultural identities which have been compelled to enter in the national cultural framework and to disappear. And historically, in France, 19th century, the schooling, public schools, compelled everybody to abandon regional cultures. And regional cultures are richness of humanity. I do not say that must not combine with a general culture, but they were radically eradicated. And this is also a major issue of cultural identity and cultural inclusion. We had exclusion, not inclusion.
Thank you very much for your very impressive talk, paper. I would just like to tease out, if I can, with you or anyone else, the impact of exclusion on the makeup of the brain, the psychological exclusion that can happen. For almost a quarter of a century, I've been working with a group of excluded people in the UK, developing psychosocial models. And I'm particularly interested in a cohort of people who I've known for 20 years, who are now in their mid-40s. I've known them since they were 20. And this cohort have prolific histories of crime, born into social exclusion from the day they were born. They've gone through transitional stages of development with turbulence. They've not been able to cognitively process what we would take as acceptable for standard life. And they have drifted into adulthood with a cognitive deficit. My interest is, how do we work with this group of people who don't really, if we're honest, want to be included? And we have a massive problem in our prisons, in that we have workforces that cannot connect within the prison system, within the social service system, out in the community, because they too, professionals, have, you could argue, a cognitive deficit that it prevents them from connecting. So you could argue that there is an exclusion in mainstream society as well that needs to be looked at. I'd like to get people's thoughts on this, if I could, if possible.
Final intervening is Professor Zulu.
Thank you. I would like to dwell on education a bit. You mentioned particularly educating people in their language, and I started to shiver a bit. I have never been able to solve this riddle, even within myself. The movement by a number of people in South Africa is that there should be some education, or education should be in the indigenous languages. Now, in a situation where there are no conceptual equivalents, because most of the concepts and ideas in modern education happened to have come when the indigenous languages had grown into conversational languages and people were able to deal with that. But dealing with such complex phenomena in the sciences, even in the philosophies, remember, most indigenous languages were oral languages and not written languages, and therefore there were great limitations. Now, trying to rename or reconceptualize without taking into cognizance, because concepts generally carry with them nuances which make meaning and relevance quite very complicated. How does one deal with that? And more or less juxtapose this to Professor Minerat's issue, where in the French situation there was a lot of, for a lack of a better word, sacrificing certain localities for purposes of creating a cultural unity, a state, and a common meaning. Now, how far holy is language that it cannot be tampered with? Why should it be original?
You have a very few minutes to answer, because our job is not finished after your answer, because we have to commemorate 2 members of the Academy.
Okay, I think that I have to talk with each one of you, but I cannot elaborate an answer to all these questions. Perhaps, just to what you have said, just like we have now immigrants who develop multiple belongings, we need, in the cultural world, we need also, we need to develop multiple skills, so to speak. And I don't know any African language, but I know some Basque, you know? Basque is a language which originally is limited to rural areas, and it's not made for philosophy. I have students who come from the, to study philosophy from the Basque country. And, well, they can learn philosophy. They don't learn philosophy in Basque, but rather in Spanish or in English or whatever, no? Yet it's important for them to keep the language in order to preserve their traditions and their practices and a pride of the people to which they belong, no? So I think both aspects are to be reconciled. We need to develop multiple belongings. We need to develop a culture which enables us to enter into the global world, so to speak, but at the same time, we need to keep our roots. The word identity, and that's the only thing I'm going to say now, the word identity appears in the horizon of 19th century when the traditions are gone. After so much movement, so much social change, traditions were shaken, and therefore they had to be recovered at the reflective level, so to speak. But this entails something artificial in itself. And what I try to say is that culture is not just a theoretical construct, it's something living. So we should not be so concerned about preserving identities as much as leading a human life. But leading a human life means also to preserve some meaningful practices, some meaningful traditions, which make sense in the community we are part of. So it's a balance, but that's life, no? A balance between the universal and the local, the particular, and yeah, that's it. I cannot say anything.